Poland has welcomed the deployment of a new multinational NATO battalion in the country's northeast. The country's president has called it a historic moment for his country. The base of operation is Oshish. This marks the first time NATO troops have been placed so close to Russian territory. The US-led battalion comprises about 1,000 troops, but also includes troops from Britain and Romania. Croatian troops are expected to join later. The decision was made during a NATO summit in Warsaw last year.
A day after welcoming neighbouring Montenegro into the NATO alliance, influential US Senator John McCain's been in Kosovo. McCain's the Republican chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee and a notable hawk in relations with Russia. He's touring the Balkans to firm up support for the EU-US reconciliation process and NATO.
My message to you is the same as the one I delivered to Serbian Prime Minister Vučić earlier this week. Advancing the EU-facilitated, US-supported dialogue is in the interest of Kosovars and Serbs alike.
Kosovo declared independence from Serbia in 2008 and is recognized by 114 nations, but not Serbia. Since December, relations between the two have been especially tense. McCain's message was also reinforced by the Germans, whose Foreign Minister Sigmar Gabriel met with Kosovo's Prime Minister Isa Mustafa.
Poland's President Andrzej Duda has welcomed the arrival of NATO troops in the northeast of the country. At a ceremony for the multinational battalion in Orzysz, he said their presence would help prevent attacks on Poland from being repeated.
Nie przesadzę.
It's no exaggeration to say that many Polish generations have been waiting for this moment since the end of World War II. They dreamed about it and they made sacrifices, beginning with soldiers who fought and died for an independent Polish state against the Soviet occupation.
Sowieckiej okupacji polegli.
The US is leading the forces backed by UK and Romanian troops. Ahead of the ceremony, Polish government sources said Warsaw hopes to welcome US President Donald Trump for a short visit in July. On Wednesday, he did an about-turn on his campaign trail criticism of the 28-member organization.
Now, the U.S. President Donald Trump has signaled Washington's support for NATO's eastward expansion into Europe, describing the Western military alliance as the bulwark of international peace and security.
The NATO alliance has been the bulwark of international peace and security. NATO allies defeated communism and liberated the captive nations of the Cold War. They secured the longest period of unbroken peace that Europe has ever known.
Now, Trump made the remarks during a joint press conference with visiting NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in a sudden shift from his anti-NATO stance during and before the election campaign. Trump said that the Western alliance is not obsolete anymore. The U.S. president also vowed to enhance Washington's partnership with the Western alliance. However, he stressed that NATO members should pay their fair share for the support the U.S. provides for them. Stoltenberg, for his part, said NATO is not seeking a new Cold War with Russia.
The message from NATO is that what we do is proportionate, it is defensive, and we don't want a new Cold War, we don't want a new arms race. And actually we strongly believe that there is no contradiction between a strong NATO, a credible deterrence and defense, and political dialogue with Russia.
The comments came as thousands of U.S. troops have already been deployed to the 3 Baltic states and Poland that all border Russia. Moscow believes NATO's anti-Russia measures run counter to international law. The Kremlin has been a strong opponent of top deployments by the Western military alliance in Eastern Europe, saying it's meant to encircle Russia. Let's speak to Javier Farhey. He's a political commentator joining us via Skype from London. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Mr. Farhey. Now, first of all, let's look at Trump's policy here. It's a U-turn, so to speak, on his approach toward NATO. But what does the term NATO is not obsolete anymore suggest?
Well, it's astonishing that in 6 months, an obsolete organization has become suddenly non-obsolete. You would imagine that an obsolete organization like NATO would need many years to become more modern. Suddenly, in 6 months' time, the whole of the NATO is a modern organization again. Obviously, the realities of power, the realities of real presidential power have made Mr. Trump think again. We mustn't forget that the military establishment, the military-industrial complex, which exists. It's not a conspiracy from some kind of sort of communist sort of plot, but it exists. Have exercised a great deal of influence in the thinking of Mr. Trump. We mustn't forget that NATO has just welcomed Montenegro as its 29th member. At the same time, what it is quite interesting is the fact that Mr. Obama, he wanted to increase what he called the deterrent powers of NATO by deploying more fighting brigades, combat brigades in NATO country, member states, especially those closer to Russia. And the current administration is determined to continue that policy. So the change of tune seems to suggest that as he moves away from Russia, he's starting to get closer to NATO. Now, he still insists that NATO should contribute more for the budget, because only few countries, the US, UK, Estonia, Greece, and Poland, are the ones that give more than 2% of the GDP, which is what they are supposed to give to NATO. He wants NATO to have all the countries in NATO to contribute more towards the cost, and he wants to move more of the protection policies, if you like, between inverted commas, to Europe instead of the US carrying the burden. But at the same time, it is obvious that the military establishment in Washington has pushed and put pressure on Mr. Trump to say, look, you can't be a president of the US if you're against NATO. You have to change your tune. And suddenly...
Well, Mr. Farhey, let me just jump in there. Is it just that a US president cannot be against NATO, or is it because now we're seeing a bigger agenda here where there is some form of a political, at least, standoff between the US and Russia, and therefore NATO fits in well in that narrative?
Well, obviously, yeah. I mean, exactly. You're making a very good point. From the moment that the government in the U.S. says that, Trump himself says that this is the lowest point in the relations between the U.S. and Russia in many years, and suddenly he talks about being positive on NATO, he will need NATO to be able to reinforce his new anti-Russian rhetoric. And NATO is very useful in this respect. We mustn't forget that when the Cold War finished, President Reagan promised President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union that NATO will not expand to the old Soviet area of influence. Actually, they did totally the opposite, and they have increasing the number of countries closer to Russia. Now, Mr. Trump is aware that many countries that are closer to the old area of influence of the Soviet Union are part of NATO, and therefore he will need those countries to reinforce his new, not very friendly, Russian relationship. So yes, I mean, his anti-Russian, his new anti-Russian rhetoric coincides with the sudden conversion to a pro-NATO position, and we will have to see how this is going to develop within the next few years. But yeah, those elements are definitely linked, and obviously the pressure in Washington by the military establishment has forced Mr. Trump to change his rhetoric as well, because we mustn't forget it's extremely powerful in the military lobby in Washington is extremely powerful. Those powers go beyond the power of the president, and obviously Trump is perfectly aware that he cannot mess with them.
Okay, that's Javier Farhey. He's a political commentator joining us via Skype from London. Mr. Farhey, it's always great having you with us here on Press TV.
Met with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. The president revised his previous statement, NATO was obsolete. President Trump now believes NATO is doing more to fight ISIS and terrorism throughout Europe and the Middle East. For more on that and the future of NATO under the Trump administration, we're joined tonight by John Ponce, CEO of the Dennis Group. Mr. Ponce, thank you. Appreciate your time tonight. Let's talk NATO's ability to fight terrorism. What is it? How good is it? How resourced are they? Good to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I would say that that's a pretty broad statement, that NATO is good or bad at anything. Specifically, different countries are better at it than others. Generally, in speaking, however, the more NATO works together as a coalition, the stronger the ability to fight the kind of terrorism that's been affecting us across the world and seems to be popping up at least once a month somewhere. So my vote would for President Trump and his statement that he believes they're no longer obsolete. My vote is that he's right. I would believe NATO is becoming more and more important as it becomes less and less possible to track terrorist activities. So the ability to be able to communicate across countries internationally is going to be absolutely seminal to prevent large-scale terrorist attacks from occurring again.
Is it fair to say that the NATO countries just don't have the intelligence arm that the United States or the United Kingdom has, or maybe even Germany for that matter? What about that?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. You know, we cut in the President Obama's tenure, we cut a lot of resources in the military. We cut a lot of resources in intelligence, and in both cases, you see the benefits of that when you turn to an asset that used to be there but isn't. We spend I think 3.6% of our GDP on defense. We've got 4 other countries in NATO. I think it's Britain, Estonia, France, and one other I can't remember, who spend 2%. The rest of them spend woefully under that. So if you're spending 3.6% of our gross national product on intelligence and the military, the truth of it is you're going to do a lot better than countries who are spending a lot less than that.
Many people think that the president's comment about NATO being obsolete was connected to financial obligations to the United States, and many people think that he has changed that position because there may be some money flowing. It's not flowing right now. How do you see it?
I couldn't agree with that more. I think the countries have resolved within NATO to be able to, within the next decade, rise to the 2% number. I think that's been a disparity that for a long time needed to be addressed. I'm very glad the president's addressing it, because the simple truth is we don't want to be the policeman of the world, but we want to be the leadership that enables us to get to the point where every country can defend themselves.
So the next question comes forward as this whole scenario moves forward about what their commitment is to fighting ISIS. Do you foresee NATO countries putting any resources into Iraq or Syria or out of their country to fight ISIS and terrorism?
Well, you're in a very difficult position if you make that commitment. Nobody wants to see Iraq repeated. Nobody wants to see Afghanistan repeated. Nobody wants to, simply put, the United States doesn't have the stomach to go in and do another nation-building long-term war right now. So I believe that it's going to be incredibly necessary for intelligence assets, for special operations type of strikes and those kinds of things, as opposed to a full-scale war in Syria. Now, Syria is undergoing the worst thing imaginable. I mean, they have 22 million people, 11 million of which are displaced, 6 million within Syria, 5 million outside of Syria, 500,000 people dead. 90% of the people have no health care, 80% are living under the poverty line, 70% have no clean water. This is a horrible thing, and now you've got their government gassing their own people. Of course, they claim that it wasn't them. Of course, they claim that an airstrike hit a chemical weapons depot that caused that to happen. But the truth of it is, we've seen this before. We know they have the proclivity to do this kind of thing. And as people in good conscience, and the president's proving himself to be one of them, we have to look at it and say, hey, we've got to be able to step up and help these people when they need it.
John Ponce, appreciate your time tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Впоследствии обстрела вооруженных сил Украины в населенном пункте Ленинское, близ домов местных жителей образовалась воронка глубиной 4 метра и диаметром 10. По информации экспертов Министерства обороны Донецкой Народной Республики, люди стали свидетелями применения реактивной системы залпового огня «Ураган».
На фоне этого расколки? Да. Осколков здесь нет, потому что местные жители говорят, были алюминиевые кусочки. Алюминий, ну его найти тяжело. То есть это не бомба, не снаряд, это ракета такая. Если алюминий, то это значит ракета. Какая ракета, я затрудняюсь. То ли тут даже точка. А где мы находимся? Что это за населенный пункт? Рядом населенный пункт. Мы проехали Заищенко, это Ленинская. Я видел 152-е вот, максимально, что у нас было, применяли, а это я не знаю. Вот это я нашел вот здесь вот сбоку дороги. Ну, видно, что это после взрыва оплавлено. Что это, я не знаю.
И вот
И вот осколок тоже. И даже